Hi, Dushini.
Was that Sweta that said hi to me?
Yes, I did.
Oh,
Yes, I
good to
did.
see you.
Good to see you too. Good to see you too. Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, how are you?
Okay, not too bad. Oh,
How
busy
is
there?
COVID? How have you dealt with COVID?
Oh, I think Sri Lanka has done pretty well. We are kind of
Yeah.
almost back to normal,
Uh-huh.
and been in office since, let me see, middle of May.
Uh-huh.
It's the economic impacts that we are now
Of course.
challenged with. Health side,
Mm-hmm.
I think pretty much under control, except Sri Lankans,
Mm-hmm.
migrants overseas who are
Yeah.
returning, and they are returning with COVID. So yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah.
That's the challenge actually. Like,
Yes,
because everybody who's been doing very well, the moment you open,
yes,
you're back to the
Uh, just to give
yeah.
you a kind of reminder that we are on Facebook Live now,
Okay.
and we'll be actually starting the program very much on time, maybe a couple of minutes before, so that I can say a few words about the event. Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay. We've been warned, Dushni.
Dushni Salim, good morning.
Good morning, and we are just keeping our video and microphone off for a few minutes before we start the program, because we are on live on Facebook. I welcome you all to the SANEM International Development Conference 2020 on COVID-19 and development challenges. And this session is on macroeconomic impacts. So before starting the session, may I request the chair, discussant, and all the paper presenters to turn their video on. Thank you. So from SANEM, we thought that a conference like this will significantly contribute to the public discourse on COVID-19 and its impacts, what we are observing all over the world. So I welcome and thank the chair of the session, Dr. Dushni Virakon, Executive Director of Institute of Policy Studies of Sri Lanka. Welcome, Dr. Dushni. 4 papers will be presented. I welcome all the presenters. Thank you so much for your contribution in creating the public knowledge on COVID-19. I also welcome Dr. M.A. Razak, Director Research, Policy Research Institute of Bangladesh, and he was also the Director of Commonwealth Secretariat in London. So Dr. Razak kindly agreed to be the discussant in this session. I welcome all the participants from all over the world, and thank you so much for your kind participation. And actually, you are an important part of this conference, and we sincerely appreciate your contribution. Few housekeeping announcements before I hand over my microphone to Dr. Dushni Virakon. The guidelines of the session have been shared with you all. The participants will write their comments and questions in the chat box, as due to the time constraint, we will not be able to allow any participant to speak in this session. The presenters will hear a notification from Mr. Mahatabuddin, who is a research fellow at SANEM and who is also the timekeeper of this session, at 12th minute that only two minutes are left. And then final notification that your time is over at 14th minute. With this, I request Dr. Dushni Virakon to kindly take over and conduct this session as the chair of this session. Over to you, Dr. Dushni. Thank you.
Thank you, Salim. Let me start by congratulating Dr. Salim Rahman and SANEM for putting together this 3-day conference. The agenda looks very impressive and very interesting. And I think it is very timely that SANEM has turned its attention to a theme of COVID-19 and the development challenges. So this session is on one of the key issues that all of us are facing in our own countries, and that is how to deal with the macroeconomic impact of COVID-19. I think the essence is still that we are still struggling in some sense to understand the channels of transmission. It started off very much as a supply side shock with disruptions to supply chains, disruptions to labor markets, but over time and quite quickly, it has turned it very much into a demand side shock as firms and businesses are struggling to generate revenues. There have been downsizing, etc., loss of jobs, as a result of which people are not spending as much, they're saving, and that consumption smoothing behavior in some sense is expected to have the far greater impact on our economies than the initial supply side disruptions. So in terms of the policy responses, we've noted that most of the multilateral financial institutions have stepped forward and said that countries and governments must do whatever it takes to mitigate the economic fallout. Do whatever it takes is, I think, in some sense easier for advanced economies. They are able to implement much larger fiscal stimulus programs, as well as to provide liquidity through their monetary policy interventions. For advanced economies, even though they do have high debt levels, many of them do, after the global financial crisis, they have accumulated high debt levels. They can still borrow at relatively low interest rates in their home countries. Those advanced economies that issue reserve currencies in particular, in some sense, don't face the same risks that emerging economies do. For emerging economies, developing countries, low-income countries, all of us, the policy space to provide a fiscal or monetary stimulus is much more constrained. Not only do we have very stretched health capacities, but most of our countries also have large sectors of our employed workforce engaged in informal sector activities without much job protection, no social protection, etc. So the challenges are much greater, the resources are much more limited, but having said that, that doesn't mean that we can sit back and not respond appropriately. So in many instances, I think the appetite to take sort of a riskier view on the extent to which we can loosen our fiscal and monetary policies in some sense are being seen as emergency measures that governments have to deal with. So for now, what we are essentially seeing is that when we look at the responses of advanced and emerging markets and low-income countries, the scale or scope of those interventions are pretty high for advanced economies as a group, fairly moderate for emerging economies, and very limited in some sense for low-income countries. And in deciding on fiscal and monetary interventions, I think many of the developing countries have opted to go for monetary policy interventions because many are suffering from weak fiscal initial conditions to begin with. But having said that, I think in this extraordinary circumstances, we are really seeing a blurring of lines between fiscal and monetary policy interventions. Some of our countries and governments are providing direct financing of fiscal expenditures. There is also interventions to what you might call yield control measures to deal with government debt management. So the lines between what is fiscal policy and what is monetary policy is also increasingly becoming blurred. So I think when we look at emerging economies and developing countries, we have to look at these measures that we've done as emergency measures to ensure that there is at least some limit or bottom line to collapses of businesses and firms, so that there is something from which we can begin to recover from as the health crisis recedes. I had an initial look at the papers that are being presented in this session, and I think they provide some very interesting country case studies in 3 papers, as well as an interesting overview of the regional challenges that the Asia Pacific region is facing. So there is a lot of rich material that is going to be presented and discussed. So I'm not going to take more time on setting the scene in terms of the overview of what are the key challenges that we are facing in terms of growth contraction. Are we going to see in some sense a recovery sooner than we expected, or is it that the downturn is much worse than what we anticipate? Many of the papers are picking up on these issues. So I'm going to go straight into the presentations. And I think the first paper that is being presented is asking the question whether COVID-19 is really an exogenous shock or whether it is an endogenous shock. Presented by Dr. Dave Nathan, from a visiting professor of the Institute for Human Development, Delhi, and research director of the Center for Research and Innovation in India. So can I call Dr. Dave Nathan to make the presentation? And Salim, you have some introductory remarks on each of the presenters, or do we just...
Share, it is over to you.
Right. So can I then invite the first presenter to make his presentation?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Veerakun. And also thanks to Salim and SANEM for organizing this conference and inviting me and my co-author Govind Kelkar to make this presentation. Now we're asking the question, is COVID-19 really an exogenous shock? In a way, this is not a question of macroeconomics, unlike an issue in that way, like the others are dealing with it. If I may put it, it is an issue of meta-economics. It's really what is the economic theory about? How are we going to look at this in terms of economic theory? So, and also, of course, it has important implications for policy. Because, for instance, now we've heard many economists speak about this. I'll just share my screen, sorry.
I have made you co-host, Dr.
Sharing
Nathan.
I'm sharing.
Yes, you can share the screen.
I think it's shared now.
Yes, you can use this slideshow. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
So the question is, well, we're posing it, is COVID-19 really an exogenous shock? On TV, you may have heard, I've heard, definitely we have heard many economists say, oh, this is an exogenous shock. So, and we have a finance minister who said this is an act of God, which is another way of saying exogenous shock. It's just a different way of saying it. So we really need to look at that question. We start with this quotation from Einstein that, look, we cannot really solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. So that itself, of course, tells you what I'm going to say in this presentation. In a sense, we have co-created this problem, and therefore we have to look closely at the economic theory we use when we created this problem and see what we need to do about economic theory in order to handle this problem and to get out of this situation. So now we are economists, divided into two kinds of shocks, exogenous and endogenous. We all learn this as undergraduates. And as I said, any economist would say that COVID-19 is an exogenous shock from outside the economic system. Now, it is certainly exogenous for a particular sector. If I am a person in finance, well, there's nothing I could have done about it. It's an exogenous shock to me. Or even an individual economy, it's an exogenous shock to the individual economy. But is it exogenous for the world economy as a whole? That's what we need to think about as we come out of adapting to this crisis and see how can we mitigate or reduce the risks of another pandemic and reduce these risks. So let's go through what is an exogenous shock. An exogenous shock may be one that has an extraterrestrial origin, something that hits the earth, the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs and changed the whole history of the world. Obviously, that was an exogenous shock. Nobody could have had anything to do with it. Or you can have a shock which was not created it is created by natural forces without any human mediation. For instance, when there's an earthquake and there's a movement of the tectonic plates, that is not something we brought about. A tsunami is not something which follows an earthquake, is not something that we brought about. However, whether it is exogenous or endogenous, the shock, the economic impact, of course, as we all again learn in undergraduate economics, is determined by the economic structure existing. The Fukushima earthquake, tsunami had a global impact because of global supply chain connections. So whether it was exogenous or endogenous, it had a global impact because of the structure of the economy. 400 years ago, that same tsunami and earthquake would have had a very limited local impact, perhaps only to Fukushima. But the way the world economy has developed now with the global value chains which span the whole globe, whether it is a earthquake in one part of the world, it affects the whole world economy, particularly some areas which are core centers of these global supply chains. But of course, the shock itself, the earthquake, may have had an entirely non-human origin. Now, let's look at COVID-19 as a shock. First of all, it is not extraterrestrial. It didn't come from outer space. It came from the biosphere, which is part of the planet Earth. It is a zoonotic disease, as they say, coming from the animal world. But is it from purely natural forces, such as an earthquake is? Now, we know there are many viruses in nature, but many of them just stay there. It's only when there is human nature interaction or animal world interaction that these viruses jump species. Now, there have been many such viruses and diseases, not just viruses, even other kinds of infections that have jumped diseases. Tuberculosis is one of them, supposed to be one. Smallpox, plague, AIDS, SARS, MERS. MERS is the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, and now COVID-19. So there have been a number of such kinds of diseases that have jumped species in history. So when does that happen? When do zoonotic diseases cross to humans? They happen, that's what we are told, in 4 kinds of conditions. When animals are forced closer together, and therefore their interaction between one animal species and another increases. When animals are forced closer to humans, and this happens with both wild and domesticated animals. More so when they are in stressed conditions. So it is stress that seems to bring about a jumping of the species of the disease from one species to another. Now, Jared Diamond, who has of course written extensively on the environment and history, points out that all of this started actually with the domestication of animals, what we call the Neolithic Revolution, agriculture, and along with the domestication of animals, which was very strong on the Eurasian landmass. Not so much in the Americas. They really didn't have domesticated animals like we have. So we don't have that originating in the Americas, but we do have it on the Eurasian landmass, cattle, pigs, camels, etc., from about 10,000 years ago. That's how far back we can trace the beginnings of these species jump of diseases from animals to human beings, and it's linked with the domestication of animals. So it's not something very new. It's been happening for a long time. Now, the point is, what do we have to do with this? Is it something that we brought about or happened by itself? Now, the economy as we know it, every economy has some kind of exchange with nature. We wouldn't live without it, including both plants and animals. We eat plants, we eat animals. So some exchange is always involved. So, but exchange is not just taking, we also give something. So exchange is also co-creation. What do we mean? What do I mean by that? We are changed by what we take from nature. If you have a vegetarian diet, there's a certain kind of body structure you have. If you have largely an animal protein diet, you have another kind of body structure or another kind of body weaknesses or strengths. So we are changed by what we take from nature. But more important for this discussion, we also change what we give to nature. For instance, we put in the crop residues, or there are the inorganic chemical residues in the land which we use for agriculture. So the land doesn't remain as it was. The land also is changed by us. It is co-created by human beings, whether it is in Bangladesh or India or everywhere, or even in what we think of as the most remote forest It is archaeologists tell us there's really nothing as a pristine forest. Humans have roamed these forests over thousands of years, and we have changed the nature of the forest. We have allowed certain trees or plants to grow. We have removed others we don't want, so that we have a co-creation of this nature. So humans and nature co-create each other. How does this work? How does it work in the context in which we are now seeing? For instance, we have a destruction of biodiverse forests, which forces animals to crowd together when the pathogens are able to jump species. Or we put large numbers of animals together, as in livestock rearing, which also creates stress for them. And of course, this is all due to because we have a high level of demand now for animal protein, and plus we also utilize wild animals in one way or the other. Now, what we have to see here is that that there is a change in scale. I read recently a paper by an anthropologist where she was pointing out that, look, small-scale societies are very different from large-scale societies in the impact they have. And this is what we have to realize. When you are utilizing wild animals from the forest on a small scale, it's very different from when you begin to utilize it on a large scale. When you do something, when you raise camels on a small scale, it's very different from when you raise camels on a large scale. And in fact, it's the shift from small scale rearing of camels to the large scale rearing of camels, which took place fairly recently in West Asia, that brought about the Middle East respiratory syndrome of MERS. So this is the important about the change of the scale and the movement from one level, from a small scale to a large scale economy. So then I want to look at what is the economic theory. This is what I really am interested in. What is the economic theory that brought us here? We have to admit we are economists, okay? I think a lot of the people in this audience will be economists. So did we have to create the problem we now have? Yes, I think so. It's our theory that helped to bring us here. How does our theory implicated in this? See, this is what we have to understand. There's a reflexivity that what we think affects what we do, and what we do affects what happens. So it is our theory that affects what we do and what we think. In fact, I don't know if you know this statement of Paul Samuelson. He says, I don't care who writes the laws of a country, so long as I can write the economics textbook. That's how important economics is, because it determines what happens in a country. So we co-created. What is the theory? Our theory, however, does not recognize co-creation. What is economics? As we all learned from Lionel Robbins, a relation between scarce means and competing ends. Yeah. So we are a theory of efficiency of cost reduction, which is the way products are selected in the market. Along with this theory, that what we have to emphasize is the efficiency of cost reduction, we have a capitalism with its endless drive for accumulation. So it's not our theory alone, but our theory is a handmaiden of capitalism with the drive for endless accumulation, which did not therefore regard what we are doing to the resources that we are utilizing. Are we just taking something and making it scarce? Or are we also changing what there is? And it is that change which has brought about the species jump and created things like what we now know as COVID-19. So,
Dr. Devnathan, you have 2 minutes left.
Thank you. Okay, so what do we do now? What is the implication of what I'm saying for policy? We need to think of theory and policy. So far our response is mainly on how do we adjust to this pandemic? We are developing vaccines to reduce infection rates. We change our behavior. We have masks. We have distancing. We have some very good changes in behavior, like this conference. I mean, we wouldn't have had this a year ago, but now it's become so easy to do an international conference. It used to be so expensive to bring Salim here, or somebody from Sri Lanka here, or all of us go to Dhaka, or all go to Colombo. But now we can do it. We're sitting in our places. So the point is, we have adapted, but there will be some other, even if we control COVID-19, there'll be the next one. So, and deglobalization will not change this. We should remember that the plague spread across Europe and changed, and even without globalization. So there will be that effect of getting across. So we have to take certain policies, for instance, reverse the reduction of the biosphere, which is resulting in the crowding of animal species, increased biosecurity, reduce stress conditions of living of animals, and modify the forms of interaction that are a threat, not a threat in small-scale societies, but can create pandemics in a globalized world. But finally, we have to also think of our economic theory, because we can't really have a policy without a theory. It's very important. I mean, we may go about making some policy in an ad hoc manner, but finally we need to know, why are we doing, why is X likely to lead to Y? And that is our theory. So we need to build a theory that is reflexive and therefore brings in the factor that what we do changes nature, that is a co-creation both of humans and of nature, both of the economy and nature. So there's no longer that binary, that this is the economy and that is nature, this is culture and that is nature. This is, whether it is sociology or anthropology or economics, this binary has been very strong. And we have to get away from that binary and come to a situation where the two are brought together in a co-creation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr.
Dr. Devanathan, if you could stop sharing your
Yes, I'm doing that.
That would be really great.
I'm trying to see how to do that. Yes, stop share. Okay.
Okay. Okay. Sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Devanathan, for that presentation. I'm sure it would generate a host of questions, which I think we come to after all the presentations are over. That is the format, Salim. Am I right? Right. So let me proceed to the second presentation, which is on COVID-19, the impact and the impetus for policy in Asia and the Pacific, by Dr. Sweta Saxena, who is the Chief Macroeconomic Policy and Analysis Section of UNESCOT Bangkok. We move from a very theoretical paper to one that takes a broad sweep look at the various impacts of COVID-19 on the Asia Pacific region, and some policy responses also that have been brought into the discussion. So Sweta, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Dushni. Salim, could you please allow me to share my slides, because I know I'm logged onto two different screens.
Sweta,
the one where you see the
yes, I have done it for both of your entries.
Okay,
so
okay.
You can actually use it now.
So share my screen. I don't see when I'm saying share my screen. One participant. Okay. Here
both entries are now co-host, so you should be able
Can you
to
see? Can you share it? Okay. Okay, sorry.
No.
Just give me. Can you see the screen?
It's coming up. Yes, I think we can.
Okay, let me actually put it up. Thank you so much. Okay, thank you so much, Dushni, and thank you, Salim, for inviting me for this thing. And thanks, actually, Dr. Nathan, for a very thought-provoking presentation. I think we could have gone on that topic for a while, because I'm interested myself in that. But anyways, let me just begin. I'm going to go much broader and from more theoretical to more, bringing you down on earth to tell you what is the socioeconomic impact of COVID on the Asia Pacific region per se, and what are the key messages. So let me just go through some of my key messages right now, because my presentation might be a little bit longer. I'll finish earlier at 14, but you'll have my slides later on. So COVID-19 is basically, everybody's saying that it's bringing unprecedented socioeconomic challenges, but the fact remains that the Asia Pacific region wasn't doing very well in terms of achieving its sustainable development goals even before COVID hit. So it wasn't on track. But ever since the pandemic hit, of course, macroeconomic policy responses have been very supportive. They're supporting the economic recovery and the health systems with a focus on vulnerable businesses and individuals. So now with all this, you are going to ask, basically, will those policies be enough in order to bring us back to where we were before the shock happened? Well, if history is any guide, it's not going to be that easy. And I'm going to show you why, because we have less policy space left now, something that Dushni was actually referring to at the beginning as well. So now, are we going to get stuck in this rut? I don't think so. There's a challenge, of course, posed by COVID, but every challenge comes with opportunities. So this is an opportunity to actually have policies that will help us, that can help us. I wouldn't say will, but they can help us actually make a more inclusive, green, and resilient world, both for people and the planet. And of course, one man or one country cannot do it alone. We need the whole village and basically cooperation from other countries to support the recovery and transition to a sustainable future. So let me just jump right into it. I said that Asia Pacific wasn't doing too well on these goals before even COVID hit. And there are going to be some challenges going forward. So let's look at this slide, but it's basically showing that if all the countries in the Asia Pacific region were on track to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, we should have been at the black line. The fact that we are not shows you that we are off track on all the goals. In fact, we've done pretty badly on the environmental front. So these are the two goals related to responsible consumption and production, goal 12, and climate action, where we've actually regressed. So while we are still reeling, the impact of COVID has been quite mixed. Mixed in the sense that it's good on the environment so far. It's been bad on the economy, and it's pretty ugly on the social side. So let me walk you through this. As Dushni initially mentioned, this whole COVID has actually come with this double whammy of shocks from both the supply and the demand side, which is basically creating one of the largest slowdowns since at least the 70s. Even during the Asian financial crisis and the global financial crisis that you can see here, we had slowdown in the developing Asia Pacific. We had some kind of, a sort of recession in the developed ESCAP region economies. However, the shock is that was nothing compared to what we are going to be experiencing now. And there are going to be downgrades in GDP growth across the region. So all the sub-regions are going to be hit equally. The gray bar basically shows you what the projections were pre-COVID and post-COVID, the difference. So they've been marked down, growth rates. The red dot is basically telling you what these growth rates are going to be for 2020 for every sub-region. Except East and Northeast Asia, of course, everybody else is going to have negative rate of growth. And the only reason it's slightly positive for East and Southeast and Northeast Asia is because of better than expected recovery in China. North and Central Asia is going to be worse because not just because of the pandemic, but the fact that it also has an oil price shock. So of course, all this economic stuff is going to be having an impact on the society. And how? Because job losses are going to exacerbate the already high inequality in our region and push lots of people into extreme poverty, which is quite worrisome because this region, Asia Pacific, has prided itself over the reduction in the achievement in reducing extreme poverty because of thanks to fast economic growth over the past couple of decades. So here are some numbers from ILO. If you look at the blue bar on the left-hand side, basically they said that in the first quarter of 2020, about 125 million people, or if you look on this right-hand side, about 7.5% of full-time equivalent jobs were lost in the first quarter. And the red bars are basically showing you what were the job losses in the second quarter. They nearly doubled during the second quarter. So what is all this going to do basically? And you can see that Southern Asia, basically, where we are, the region we are talking about, Bangladesh, India, and all these countries, they tended to have a huge loss in full-time equivalent jobs. Now, you might wonder, actually, what does this have to do with anything else? Well, inequality is one of the reasons why this region has been, and this particular sub-region has been very much affected. How? Because when you have a high level of inequality, that means access to education is very low. And when you have low access to education means most of the labor force has basic or less than basic education. So the green bars here would show you the percentage of labor force that has basic education and the less than basic education. And the one in the orange bar is about basic education. you see that in an area like South and Southwest Asia, majority of our labor force works actually in the has less than basic or less than basic education, which not surprisingly means that a lot of these countries tend to have workers who work in the informal sector. Informal sector is one where you do not have job security or social security coverage. And of course, these countries were severely hit by the shutdowns. So here you see most of these kind of people work in the informal sector. So you see on the vertical axis, you have the percentage of people employed in the informal sector. And on the horizontal axis, you see the stringency of the lockdowns. So the higher the stringency and higher the proportion, those were the countries that were hit the most. And as you can see, most of these countries up in the grayish region are from South and Southwest Asia. Now, the fact that a lot of people work in the informal sector also made it very hard for people to work from home, because in order to work from home, you have to have a job that would allow you to do that. Plus, you need to have access to the internet, and not just internet, but also fast internet. So this region is kind of known for having a big digital divide. So here you can see that in 2017, the number of internet users, and on the horizontal axis, you see in 2008, all the points are above the 45-degree line. That tells you that in 2017, more people had access to, there were more internet users, so to speak, which is a good thing. However, there is a big digital divide between the high-income countries, which are in red color, versus the low-income countries, which are basically in the turquoise. Now, international band, you also need fast internet. And of course, again, here you see that in 2017, the speed of the internet was better than it used to be in 2008. But still, the fact remains that there is a big divide between the high-income countries and the low-income countries here. Now, what does this all mean? That, well, here you go. That whereas in the world, about 18% of the people can work from home. World average of working from home is basically 18%. For our region, it is only 12% because of this entire digital divide and a lot of informality where workers cannot work from home. And the impact of these job losses tend to have is on extreme poverty. So these are the World Bank estimates that actually say that thanks to COVID, apparently anywhere from 38 million to 52 million people in the region could be pushed into extreme poverty. And we are talking about extreme poverty, which means we are talking about a poverty line basically of $1.9 per person per day. If we raise the ambition beyond that to $3.20 or $5.50, the numbers that are going to be pushed below poverty lines would be even higher. There is a lot of research recently that has come out also that shows that pandemics are expected to increase inequality. And how? Because there are going to be lots of losses of jobs, and the loss of employment is actually going to happen in the sectors where a lot of low-skilled workers are going to be employed. And this brings us back to the same point I made earlier, that with less than basic education, most people work in the informal sector, and they are the ones who are going to get affected the most. So every dark cloud has a silver lining. So the silver lining, everybody has enjoyed good air around. These are just some pictures from some kind of pictures on the quality of air, basically for a select Asia-Pacific country, cities in Asia-Pacific region. As you can see that the orange line, which shows you what the level of pollution in the air was in 2020, compared to 2019, which is in blue line, we see that it has been a lot lower. And what you see in the shaded area is the lockdown period. So of course, we have seen cleaner environments, so to speak. And I live in Bangkok, where it has been a lot cleaner, and people have been telling me that they can breathe, they can start to breathe now. However, the fact that we see cleaner airs is not enough, because now we are seeing another form of pollution in the US, single-use personal protective equipment. They've been all over the place, and because of COVID, people have started ordering online. They've started going for online shopping and food delivery, which means we need a lot more plastic in order to be able to deliver all this. So even if some countries initially were thinking of kind of slowly moving towards, greener initiatives like banning single-use plastic. They're going to be postponing such efforts. So that's the bad part, actually, that it's once everything picks up, you're not going to actually see the benefits on the environment.
Dr. Sota, you have 2 minutes left.
2 minutes? Okay. I'm just going to actually go over these ones. Then I don't have the time for the next ones. You can actually look at the slides. Almost all countries have rolled out fiscal packages. Basically, the size of the fiscal package has been about 5.3% for the Asia Pacific. The median size has been 5.3%, and they have been used to support healthcare systems and vulnerable businesses and households. And of course, monetary policy has also helped, basically, as something Dushni was mentioning at the beginning as well. Now, can this time be different? Can we actually really recover from this? I really wanted to show you this particular slide because what it shows you is that it is going to be really hard for us to actually recover from this, because there's a lot of research. My own research has shown previously that effects from shocks are permanent. And here are two big shocks that the region has experienced: the Asian financial crisis as well as the global financial crisis. During both these periods, we experienced a slowdown in growth, actually. And even if growth went back to the pre-crisis or pre-shock levels, it didn't go far enough in order to put you back on the pre-crisis trend of GDP. So there has been a permanent loss in output in both these crises. Now, can we actually go back? Yes, we could if we really grow very fast. But growing fast, as I showed you, that the prediction for 2020 and even prediction for 2021 is not going to be that bright, is that growth rates are going to be much lower than they were before this pandemic hit. And this is partly also as a result of the fact that we have much smaller policy space now than we had before. So just to give you a sense that in terms of monetary policy, the left-hand side figure basically shows you what were the policy rates on the eve of the pandemic versus on the eve of the global financial crisis. Everything is below the 45-degree line. That means the interest rates right now are much lower already than they were at the time of the global financial crisis, which leaves less room for monetary policy. And of course, whatever room that they had, they've already used up since the beginning of this year, which is here on the horizontal axis, up to August. So the rates are already lower. And on the fiscal side, of course, the government debt is a lot higher on the eve of the pandemic here on the vertical axis versus what it was at the time of the global financial crisis, which means it puts a dent in the government's ability to kind of, spend your way out of this crisis. I'll skip this. Is there a better way forward? Yes, in the short run, you can do lots of things. You can still contain the pandemic, until a vaccine is found. Continue to wear your mask and all those kind of wash your hands. And of course, you can introduce a little bit sustainability requirements in all the packages that we've been actually giving. Make when you're giving a loan out, you must actually make sure that these things are being spent on the society and for the environment. And you can plan reopening better. But I'll probably not have much time, but there are lots of solutions I have going forward. You can look at the slides, but there is a way to build forward better, which means in order to actually be able to put yourself in a better situation to deal with such a shock in the future, you really need to work towards making and building an inclusive, green, and resilient economy, which works for people and planet. Now, what does all this mean? It means that you have to put the 2030 agenda at the center of the post-COVID recovery, rather than really going back to the same. Let's actually have the GDP growth-centric rebound, something that's not very good. Do I still have the time?
Your time is up.
Okay, that's fine. People can look at, I have some solutions for what can be done for the people and planet actually going forward. You can look into the slides. The slides are pretty self-explanatory. Thanks. Oh, should I get out of it? Should I stop sharing now?
Yes, please.
Okay, good.
Thank you, Sweta. I think that the presentation brings to the fore the importance of the scale of the economic fallout. I think the permanent loss of output is a real concern, because as was very clearly shown, the policy space that's available is much less than we've had during previous crises. And if you look at the preferred options, fiscal policy, particularly on the spending side, has a immediate positive impact on recovery efforts given its multiplier effects, whereas monetary policy, that works with a lagged effect and is less effective unless complemented very strongly by fiscal policy. The fact that for many developing countries in this part of the world, fiscal space is so constrained means that the tendency is to rely much more on monetary policy, which also doesn't guarantee that there will be a very resilient and sustained recovery ahead of us. I think if time permits during the question and answers session, perhaps we can touch on some of the policy solutions that's contained in her presentation, which she unfortunately didn't have time to touch on. I hope that we will come back to that, because those are also, I think, very important. The third presentation in this session is on COVID-19 and development challenges, possible socio-economic impacts on the Moroccan economy by Said Faraji, who is Head of Department of Multisectoral Models under the Ministry of Economy and Finance. May I now invite Mr. Faraji to make his presentation.
Hello all.
Yes, we can hear you.
Hear me?
And yes, and you can share your screen. If...
Okay. Can you see the screen?
Yes, screen is fine. You can go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, dear organizing committee, good day to you. Let me start by introducing myself shortly. My name is Said Faraji. I'm doctoral research in field of statistics and economics, and at the same time head of the multi-sectoral models in the Ministry of Economy and Finance. I'm glad to be with you today to present this work co-authored by Professor Nazhaj Zawjel and Dr. Rashid Matawi. Today, I present myself as a doctoral researcher. Therefore, all opinions and conclusions that emanate from this study are those of the co-authors, not of ministry. Okay. COVID-19, with all its versatile facets, contradictory layers, unpredictable facts, and ambiguous future, is certainly an event of current date. However, in the middle of all these uncertainties, there is one thing that is still certain: future impacts are hard to accurately measure. But the present ones definitely are here with us. No country is spared, and mine, Morocco, is no exception. So you can guess that I will be dealing with some of socio-economic impacts of this pandemic. Okay. So the plan of this presentation is to begin with a short idea about the Moroccan economy that we will face with the challenge of this pandemic, analysis approach and the impact to analyze this impact assessment, impacts of economic problem and public support, because we will show what impacts of the economic problem without any intervention of economy, and also with public support. And finally, it will be useful to present a summary and main findings on in the light of the results. Now, about the economy of Morocco, we will present some structural characteristics. Moroccan economy is structurally growth driven by local demand, the job market dominated by the primary sector and the tertiary sector. We are an open economy with an important contribution of foreign trade in our GDP. More precisely, the European Union is our principal partner. We have a structural negative trade balance, and a large share of import constitutes our intermediate consumption. That's in order to see the importance of foreign trade in our economy. And about our public sector, we have a deficit, structural deficit, budget deficit, but controlled. The ratio, the budget deficit to the GDP is controlled. We have a most financing coming from tax revenues and some transfer and some donate. And the important thing is that the public sector plays an important role in stimulating investment. So now, in order to analyze the impact of COVID on our economy, we suggest an ex-ante analysis of the macroeconomic, sectoral, and social impact, because this work is scientific assessment, evaluation, and not a work to an official evaluation or to give a concrete solution. It's a framework of analysis. That's I want to mention. So the tools used is a multi-sectoral model, because we want to see the sectoral impact, some economic and some social impact. The tools is a model, it's a computer general equilibrium model. We will use a PEP standard model to adapt it for the Moroccan economy. And to adapt this, we have to use the last data, official last data. It's about a building of social accounting matrix. The last data we have in Morocco, official, is about some scientific tables, input, output tables, and some financial tables of the year of 2018. This social matrix considered 19 sectors. In these 19 sectors, 2 primary sectors, 6 secondary sectors or industry, and the rest is tertiary sector. About the evaluation of social economic impacts, we will use a latest official national household survey. It's of the 2014, carried by the HCP. HCP is the High Commission of Planning, the organization which do these surveys. And in this survey, the sample contain 16,000 households, but for this study, we will just use 100, and it's an aggregation in order to make a micro-simulated CGM for the impacts of poverty. Poverty here is according to the expenditure approach, according to the consumption, obviously. So, in order to do the shock and to use the model, the main of work was to translate some registered negative impacts occurred during the first semester of this year, officially registered and recorded, and to present the official public measures really adopted by using all the official proposal measure accorded by the government. So this shock, it translates for the negative impacts without any measures, the registration or the duration of the events from January to June, according to some official sources of data. For example, the Department of Trade, some other public department, and also there was a survey with some companies in order to see and to pick up their opinion about what they expect from this pandemic. The expectation concerns the activity, the performance, financial performance, and the labor. It will be, it's normal that all the expectations are pessimistic. So the numbers in this table is about the export sector, because the shock will concern the trade, international trade. It's an evidence. It's obvious. Sorry, and the most affected sectors are presented here: agricultural, food, some industries, and the main, the most affected services like hotel and restaurants and transportation. This to say the touristic impact, and it is also a decrease in transfer household. A decrease transfer household, like foreign demand. It's the data. It's a calculation of the evolution of 6 months. You will remark that it's not a high decrease. It's normal because in Morocco, impact, the first COVID case was in March. So we can speak about a 3-month effect. That's why we can see that decrease is not so high. And about measure, the government naturally adopt some measure, because we had the chance to see what happened in the rest of the world, and in specifically in Europe. We are an economy near to Europe, and we have a large community, Moroccan community in Europe. So the transfer, the most of transfer comes from Europe. So to summarize, we will do 2 shocks. Shocks in decrease in the foreign sector demands. These are sectoral decrease, although it's not negative numbers, but it means that it will be negative in the model. And a decrease of in the transfers of household. Official public measures. The public measures are very various, but the most important and the most directly given effectively was support for households, because the government adopted a transfer in the majority of affected household. Just for an idea, for the household with the size of less than 2 people, it's about 800 dirhams. For household size between 2 and 4 individuals is about 1,500 dirhams, and more than 4 individual persons is about 2,000 dirhams. These are the transfer household gone to the household without with the Ramid. It's household registered as need in help support, and also some household in the informal sector, because in Morocco informal sector is important, and many households live with an informal activities. Second part of official support measure concern the business support. It's a transfer with 2 programs. More details are in the paper. It's
Mr. Farzi, you have 2 minutes left.
Okay. So these are the official support measures. We can go directly to some main results. The macroeconomic impacts can be summarized as in this table. We will see that all the numbers are negative, that's normal, and the chart of bar charts in the blue are without support public convention, and in red it's with combined shock. We will see that the most affected, the biggest macroeconomic impacts concern imports of all commodities, the global import, income of household and of the firms. Also, the tax revenue and non-tax revenue were severely affected. To second part of results concern some sectoral results. So this is the selection of the most affected sectors. We will begin by the imported commodity because the shock is so direct. So most of the sectors are affected. The sectors from the three big sectors, it's about services, some industries, and also agriculture and aquaculture fishing. The output or value added will be affected for some sectors. Not all sectors will be severely affected, but this table presents the most affected in the order of decreasing. So we can say that transportation, industry, and construction was the most affected sectors in sectors production. The second part is after the supply side. In the demand side, we have a general decrease of consumption of household, but it's not a big decrease because the household continue to consume. There is no really a problem. But the problem is the investment demand on for purpose in some commodities. We can see that the industry is the most affected, also agricultural, and this is it's due to the arrest of activity for 3 months of confining in Morocco.
Dear President, your time is up.
Okay. Just quickly, this to say that the government revenue was severely affected. In social, the labor will be affected in the most of important sectors, and the poverty rate will increase in 16%. And some findings, the most important findings, is that the serious negative impact will affect import, investment, poverty. The public measure effects will not eliminate, but slightly mitigate, because this is justified by 2 points. First is that the objective of the support is not to eliminate the negative effects, but to avoid the economic cardiac arrest. And the second point justifying this is that also the main tax revenue and non-tax revenue government was severely affected. Finally, all this presentation, thank you, and all this, thank you for your attention, and sorry for the delay. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Faraji. I think that was a very interesting modeling exercise for to give a country-specific example of the sectoral impacts. And I'm sure that there will be questions on the. I saw some questions already coming in the chat box related to the specific areas that you touched on. and how whether these same kind of modeling exercises can also be done in other countries to better understand what the overall macroeconomic impact is at household as well as at sectoral levels. We will be finishing up on the presentations with the fourth and final paper, which looks at the growth at risk modeling to understand India amidst the COVID-19 uncertainty, which is being presented by Dr. Indrani Mana, Assistant General Manager, Research of the Reserve Bank of India. I believe this is also a modeling exercise to understand the probability of how India's growth contraction might look like as a result of the COVID-19. So let me invite Dr. Mana to make a presentation.
Thank you, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you very much and a very good afternoon to everyone. I'll just share my screen. Okay, so at the outset, I would say that this is a paper in progress and I would appreciate your comments. That would help me improve the paper. And as a disclaimer, these views are absolutely mine and not that of the Reserve Bank of India. So before I detail the COVID uncertainty in India, it's important to understand the status of the Indian economy at the twilight of the COVID crisis. Okay, so as you might be knowing, that the Indian economy has been witnessing a lot of financial stress events, beginning with the asset quality review of 2015. When the NPA norms in the banking sector were changed and there was an early recognition of default loans. So the economy underwent a lot of institutional changes during that time. But the most important thing was that the public sector banks, which accounted for almost 65% of our total assets, total banking assets, reduced the credit supply to the economy. In the interim, the non-banking sector filled the gap, but in September 2018, even the non-banking sector underwent a crisis because of a default by one of the NBFCs, and the confidence in that sector waned. And as a result of these financial frictions, the average quarterly growth rate in the Indian economy during 2019 was only 4.85%, as against a growth rate of 6.8% in 2018. The Indian economy was recovering from this crisis when the COVID-19 hit us. So just to put things into perspective, we entered the crisis with a fragile financial sector. Now, this crisis, the COVID crisis, is very, very different in nature from the earlier big crisis that we have seen, the global financial crisis and the sovereign debt crisis. It consists of multiple shocks. We started with a policy-induced supply shock, followed by external demand and domestic demand shock, a productivity shock which is still unaccounted for, and maybe a human capital shock for which we have no data, financial price shocks, and a leverage shock which is waiting to happen. So in this paper, I look at the impact of current demand and financial conditions on the expected growth distribution of India using the IMF's growth at risk framework. And just to put things again into perspective, the growth at generally the conventional macro models, they look at the expected mean growth without taking into consideration the volatility or the higher moments of the distribution. But when growth weakens, it is this high distribution, the skewness, the volatility, that becomes more important. And overlooking them might actually be underestimating the underlying risks to growth. So I try to simulate the growth performance of the Indian economy at the tails of the distribution under multiple shocks, as we can envisage, as much we can envisage in a COVID scenario. And I compare the pre-COVID with the COVID phases. I list out the findings that I had before going into the details. So I find that the shocks through the financial and demand channel, they enhance the tail risks to growth significantly. Okay, and when we double the size of the shocks, we find that there is an exponential and an asymmetric increase in the growth at risk framework. Again, just to give a start to the discussions, a brief view of the timeline of the COVID crisis. I think we encountered the first COVID case in late January, but the nationwide lockdown was imposed on March 25th. And then the lockdown was extended from time to time every 15 days. And even today, we have a lockdown in the containment zones or the red zones where the infection rates are very high. But on the other hand, I would like to stress that India opened up as early as April 20th, okay, when agriculture and the e-commerce were allowed to open up. And gradually, even I think on June 8th, we have entered into unlock phase 1.0, and currently unlock 5.0 is underway. So you can understand the resource strain on the state governments, on the central government, which led to this early opening up. Yes, there was an economic stimulus package which amounted to around 20 trillion Indian rupees, and which is around 10% of Indian GDP, and it consists of financial and monetary concessions. According to an estimate of the IMF, direct spending and deferred revenue amount amounted to around 2% of GDP, and boost to businesses and credit provision to different sectors amounted to 5% of GDP. What was the impact of the COVID? It's not very different from other countries. First and foremost, it was an unprecedented supply and demand shock. So there was a significant decline in the consumption of durable and non-durable goods because of an income shock, which came from job losses and wage cuts, as well as a self-induced aversion to make contact with people on the part of the populace, which led to a decline in consumption. What I've done here on this table, if you see, this is the Y-on-Y growth rates of retail consumer goods across 3 phases. So on the first column, I have the last quarter of 2019, that is October-December quarter. These are the growth rates of consumer goods. Then the second column is the first quarter of 2020, which partially coincides with our COVID phase because we entered into lockdown on March 25th. And then the last column is the April-June quarter. I call it the pure COVID phase because we were into a lockdown during this phase. And you can see all the positives on the first column turn into great large negatives on the third column, ranging from -57% to -87% decline in growth rates of consumption of durable and non-durable goods. The only sector which registered a least negative growth rate was the toiletries, soaps, and detergents for obvious reasons. We also saw an increase in the Bloomian investment uncertainty during this phase. There was a natural tendency on the part of the investors to wait and watch before committing to investment projects. So fresh investments announced declined from 61% during 2019 last quarter to a decline of 42% during the second quarter of 2020. Investment projects dropped and shelved or abandoned also peaked during the first quarter of 2020, as you can see from this table. Seasonally adjusted real GDP growth rate, it dropped to 2.98% in the first quarter of 2020, and then with a great negative growth rate of -23.6% during the second quarter of 2020, which is the pure COVID phase. Unlike other crisis periods, this crisis originated in the real sector and moved to the financial sector. So we find that there was an increase in financial stress. Term spreads on 10-year government paper, it increased from 105 basis points in the last quarter of 2019 to almost 216 basis points during in the second quarter of 2020. Sovereign risk premium, that increased from 477 basis points during the last quarter of 2019 to around 501 basis points during the second quarter of 2020. About the labor market, we know very less, and you might have all seen how uninformed we are about the Indian labor market. And I think we need a serious change in the definition of the informal sector. But some organizations have actually put up some figures, so I'm putting up that here. So there was around an 18 million salaried job lost during April 2020, and around 5 million job losses during July 2020. So what am I doing here? What is my methodology? I'm trying to assess the growth at risk. So the growth at risk, in the words of Adrian, is actually the probability, finding out the probability of future real GDP growth rate falling below a certain threshold. Okay. So the concept is very close to the value at risk framework. Now, what's the basic idea behind this? What we're trying to do is, there are a number of variables which actually motivate GDP. Okay. Now, in the interest of parsimony, since we are doing a forecasting exercise and we need to reduce parameter uncertainty, we partition the variables into different categories, variables which are economically similar into different categories, and then work out the common trends from these variables using dimension reduction methods like principal components or the linear discriminant analysis. And after creating these partitions, we fit a nonlinear relationship between the state-dependent partitions and the future GDP using the quantile regressions. These are the partitions that I have used in my framework. So the first partition is the domestic financial conditions, which groups variables that actually capture the domestic price of risk, the cost of funding, ease of obtaining finance, or financial stress events. Say, for example, we include variables like term spreads, which capture the stance of monetary policy, or corporate spreads, which capture the return on business fixed investment or corporate profitability. Then we have my second partition is the leverage partition, which captures the weaknesses in, say, the balance sheet of banks. So we have variables like NPAs to total loan ratios here. Or we have variables like weaknesses in the corporate balance sheet, like the corporate interest coverage, okay? Or external stress variables like the external debt to GDP ratio or the current account deficit to GDP ratio here. My third partition is the external sector, which captures the macroeconomic performance of external economies like US, Euro area, and Japan, which motivate the global consumer sentiment. And the fourth module is the domestic demand, which I included, particularly keeping in mind the COVID exercise. And this includes the sales of durables and durable goods, which I already explained in the last few slides. I'm trying to include another module, which is the uncertainty module, to look at the impact of investment uncertainty or policy uncertainty on future growth GDP, and it's a work in progress. So this is the quantile regression that I'll be doing after setting these partitions. On the right-hand side, all the X's that you see are the partitions. We have the finance partition, XF, leverage, XL, XE is the external, and XD is the demand partition. On the left-hand side, we have the GDP growth rate, age horizons forward. So just a few words about the nature of Indian economy that I get from my exercises. Generally, there's a thinking, there's a thought that Indian economy is a consumption-led growth story. Now, what I find is that what you see on this slide is that I have plotted the marginal effects of the demand partition on the future GDP growth rates, and
Dr. Sita, you have 2 minutes left.
Across horizons and across different partitions. I'll just have to. So what I find is that the consumption actually peaks in the 6th quarter. So it is predictive only of the short run growth and not the long run growth. While on the financial conditions are actually predictive of long run growth, long run underlying risks to growth. I'll jump to the simulations exercise, which is the major thing in my work. So what I've done here is I have given a 2 standard deviation shock to the financial sector, domestic demand shock, a negative 2 standard deviations, and a negative 2 standard deviation shock to the external sector. And this is what we find. With a 5% probability our baseline growth declines after the shock to negative 0.5% in a pre-COVID period. And with a 10% probability, the growth declines to 0.8% in the pre-COVID period. But in the post-COVID period, there is a significant increase in these risks. Okay, with a 5% probability, growth declines to minus 3.8%. And with a 10% probability, growth declines to minus 0.1%. And the probability that growth is below zero actually jumps from 5% to 10%. When we double the size of the shocks, you can see the last column, the COVID period, the growth risks increase from minus 4% to almost minus 11%. So that's what I was talking about. If we conclude this, we are actually concerned about two specific things. One, the growth rate 1 year ahead. We are forecasting future growth rate is anywhere between minus 4 to minus 11%. But that's a lower threshold because we are concerned about two financial stability concerns. One, what if the interest rate cycle moves up? Our inflationary expectations are not well anchored, which means any agricultural mashup can lead to a rise in inflation, which can lead to a rise in the interest rates. And the moratoriums that we have given for so long to different partners of the economy might be taken aback, which means there could be stresses in the household balance sheet as well as the bank's balance sheet, as well as the firm's balance sheet, which will spill over into the bank's balance sheets. The second concern is that of the investment crunch. Okay, so I've already talked about investment projects being shelved. Okay, now investment crunch might lead to a lower growth rate down the line 1 year ahead, okay? And that could be very, very strong. So this, as I said, we entered the economy with a fragile financial sector. So unless we improve work with that, we can't really go on with recover from this crisis very quickly. Thank you very much, and thanks for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Mana. I think that's a very rigorous and technical modeled paper that tries to understand at a more sort of disaggregated level the extent to which the monetary policy interventions that India has rolled out is going to sustain that recovery. I think the issue of the effectiveness of monetary policy, and particularly given very weak asset quality in the financial systemic risks that most of our countries face, very pertinent questions about the inflationary expectations beyond the recovery phase. I think all our countries are now facing a deflationary bias, but at some point with the amount of liquidity that's been injected, that's going to turn around. And are we then prepared to raise interest rates and see that recovery stalled? I think a question that perhaps we should come back to in that discussion. Now I think the presentations of the 4 papers are done with, and now it is my pleasure to invite Dr. Razak, who is the Director of Research of the Policy Research Institute in Bangladesh, to share his observations on the 4 papers in his role as the discussant. Dr. Razak, floor is yours.
Madam Chair, thank you. At the outset, let me thank Dr. Salim Raihan and SANEM for organizing this conference. I must congratulate them, but also I express my sincere appreciation for asking me to be the discussant for this particular session. Now, all the papers, Madam Chair, as you have seen, are really, really interesting. And it is indeed a daunting task for me to make, useful comments on these papers, within these, short time framework that has been given. But let me just highlight, I think a couple of issues on each of the paper, and then perhaps, we can have a bit of discussions. Now, with regard to the first paper, the COVID-19, whether this is an exogenous shock, what an amazing, powerful message, that has come out of the paper. I mean, that is quite extraordinary. I mean, I must say that when I first saw the title of the paper, I decided not to read the paper for a while, and rather thinking about a system like, that can have truly exogenous shock. Now, yes, I mean, the famous uh, asteroid that hit the Earth some 65 million years back was truly exogenous. But that was exogenous to the system of the economy run by, I think, the dinosaur kingdom at the time, not humanity. But these days, it is the humanity's economic relations with the nature that can do generate like these kind of consequences, and that would be endogenous in nature. Now, the climate change and environmental degradation are also not exogenous, in that sense, we know. Indeed, we'll all agree with the authors when they say in adapting to COVID-19, we also need to think of mitigation or reducing risk from our interaction with biosphere. I mean, I think the point is very clear. And to incorporate mitigation, we must look to see how economic theories can incorporate the reflexive nature of the cooperation, as the presenter so eloquently has made that point. But in my view, Madam Chair, I think the authors have alluded to a more elegant and, in my view, most timely notion of exogeneity with severe implications for the humanity. For many of us, in our day-to-day mundane modeling exercise, we don't have the luxury of considering such an overarching snapshot. So we test for weak exogeneity or super exogeneity in economic relations that hardly deal with path-breaking solutions to global problems that we badly need these days. So true, I mean, after hearing this particular presentation, I think we need to change. And from that perspective, I believe this paper can be considered as a kind of wake-up call. And I believe we all will agree to that particular point that has been highlighted. Let me now move on to the second paper, which is more socioeconomic impact of COVID-19, looking from the regional perspective. Now, this is an excellent summary of COVID-19 consequences for the Asia Pacific. Very informative. And there is no denying, the kind of priorities that have been pointed out in the paper, like, the recovery policies, how we can build better, going ahead in terms of having inclusive, green, and building resilient economies. I mean, all the points made, I think, in my view, I would agree with them. I would rather, focus on the policy solutions part of the presentation. I mean, that the presenter could not elaborate, but, from the slides, I'm going to make, a few comments. The first one is with regard to the 2030 agenda, and the point that has been made is this: whether this should be, I mean, like, in implementing it, whether the growth should play the central role in it or not. I mean, the whole idea is let's focus on the sustainable development goals rather than economic growth. In my view, that recommendation is probably true in normal times, But right now, when the growth has gone down by so much, many governments will find it a bit more challenging, just to make the implementation of sustainable development goals as the priority focus rather than the growth. And how we're going to deal with this problem is going to be a challenge for, I think, most economies, where we have seen growth falling tremendously, and that most finance minister would now consider as their principal objective. Now, the second issue is, and there, perhaps, we can all agree on the fact, that this COVID-19 crisis has shown the sort of the holes in our social protection system, health system. And that would require, I believe, in a lot of investment going forward. So that recommendation is fully well understood. On the climate initiatives, again, given the growth consideration, this could be challenging, but this presentation has made some very good recommendations, like, where we can make, certain improvements in tackling fuel subsidies, and also in bringing in new initiatives like introducing carbon taxes, but this is where I believe, many of ESCAP member countries will see a lot of challenges from the technical way of doing it, but also implementing it. For having these kind of reforms means the policymakers they have to deal with the political economy of protection measures that we are familiar with, and that is perhaps one of the biggest hurdles that we have to overcome in take this agenda forward. One observation is this about the increased investment requirement. Like we all know, even prior to COVID-19 shock, there has been a lot of discussion on what the additional funding would come from in promoting the sustainable development agenda, in making sure that countries are materializing the gains and those goals. So after COVID-19, that issue will become even more prominent. So what the investment will be coming from. And given the fact that the private sector has taken so much hit, and the discussion prior to sustainable development goals adoption was that some of the investment will be coming from the private sector itself. So growth going down, private sector is taking a very bad hit. One fundamental question is where the new investment will be coming from in the years ahead of us. My final comment on this particular presentation would be, there has been a lot of emphasis on regional cooperation, and I agree with all of it. But the problem that I see these days is the global cooperation, in my view, that is becoming even more a kind of a critical problem. We saw the challenge that the WHO, the World Health Organization, faced earlier this year. And we're also seeing the global trading system is now under some kind of existential threat. The trouble is now, whether you can go for increased regional cooperation when the global system is in crisis. So I believe one key recommendation for us will be to think about building multilateralism. I believe that could be one of the best way forward in dealing with this kind of shock like COVID-19 and the emerging implications. Okay, now I would like to move on to the paper on. I must say this presents an interesting case, and in many ways this is a classic case of COVID-19 problem that are being faced by many developing countries. From the Morocco paper, we have seen external demand for domestically produced goods and services falling, remittances are declining. I mean, many Asian economies are in the similar situation. Now, the authors use a computable geological model, and that model, from the paper I understand, was adapted to their 2018 social accounting metrics. And it also used the official survey, 2014, the household survey, to study the socioeconomic impact. And the shocks that have been considered as part of the model from the paper I understand is the decline in foreign demand. And some of the statistics are very powerful. The textile and leather industry have suffered 32% decline. Hotel restaurants, the number 59%, transportation 51%. So the shocks are pretty clear. Now, the decrease in transfers to the Moroccan households living abroad has been shown to be about 7%, which is again a big number. Government support, I found it quite interesting. And as I understand from the paper, close to 70% households receive some kind of transfers from the government. There have also been the support for business enterprises. And the results show that the decrease in world demand for Moroccan exports causes GDP to fall by about 7% in market prices. Local production, we say that in some cases it fall and other cases it increase. So one question that I would like to ask is about the model closure, whether the full employment is being maintained, and that will certainly have interesting consequences for this kind of modeling exercise. Now, with regard to the socioeconomic impact results for poverty, I mean, there is a table in the paper, table 7, that shows that with foreign demand shock, poverty incidence rise to about 7.4%. I think that's the number. But then when foreign demand and household transfer shocks are put together, the poverty incidence remain at 7.5%. I mean, it is difficult to understand, like, why that number does not change, or why we don't see increase in poverty incidence, because the shocks are now being combined together. The impact of public support is negligible, as has been shown from the simulation results. So I would like to know, why is that so? And in that case, why the government would be rolling out, those kind of measures, where the impact is that low. I think the authors, and if I have understood correctly, like, they have got 121 types of households. So I'd be interested in knowing if anything can be said about which households are more vulnerable and which ones are less so, or more resilient. I think that would give us a bit more interesting insights. My final focus will be on the fourth paper, Growth at Risk in India. I must say, I mean, in my view, this paper should be of great interest to many of us, I think because of two reasons. One is the Indian growth story. We always find it quite interesting, as the country has now emerged as a global economic powerhouse. And of course, the paper then uses the recently trending approach of the growth at risk framework. And it simulates the growth at the tails. Tail risk is the chance of loss occurring due to a rare event, as predicted by a probability distribution. And I personally think it could be an exciting area of work for many other countries as well. Now, the author finds COVID shock tail impacts are long-lasting, are longer than other shocks that she has considered. Partitions we have seen, and she has explained, include financial condition, leverage, external sector, domestic demand, and uncertainty. I would like to have two basic questions, partly because how the partition variables are chosen and to what extent the results could be sensitive to what variables are being selected. And my next issue will be, like, it has been acknowledged in the paper that in addition to financial and demand shocks, there could be other shocks as well. Now, what impact, like, one could foresee because of these excluded shocks, that are not being, considered? In the external sector, for example, I mean, we have seen we have the GDP growth of trading partners, like, India's main trading partners and their growth. The question is, and probably I would like to ask, just for a bit of clarity, why do we include, say, for example, if we have trade-related uncertainty, I mean, the global trade, we have got that kind of crisis. So do we have to then consider, like, how the India's partners are faring in terms of economic growth, and is it going to come through that particular channel, or we can explicitly consider, the link to address, those kind of issues?
Dr. Razak, you have 2 minutes left. I mean,
overall, I do think this is an excellent paper, and this line of research can add, I believe, further value to some of the forecasting exercise, that we do for policymakers. Madam Chair, I think I would like to stop here, and probably I have saved 1 minute from the organizers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Razak. I think you've raised some very, very important questions to all the presenters. I have a request from Dr. Salim, if he's okay with that, I would like to donate the 10 minutes that have been allocated for the chair to make closing remarks. I think those 10 minutes can be used much more usefully to respond. The presenters respond to some of the questions that have been raised. And I see so many questions that have popped up in the chat box. So I will just take 1 minute to sum up. And since we are about 10 minutes behind schedule, I think much better that we use it for some interactive discussions amongst the panel, as well as those who have signed on from outside. So how do we now take the question and answer session? Do I give back to the panel? to respond to Dr. Razak's observations on there?
Yeah, I think you can give 3 to 4 minutes to each panel paper presenters. They should respond to the discussion points as well as some of the questions which have been posted in the chat box.
Right.
And then if we have time, we can come back for a second round, but depending on the time availability.
Great, thank you. So let me start in a reverse order to respond to the queries that Dr. Razak raised, as well as any other questions that have been posed to you in the chat box, starting with Dr. Mana.
Thank you, Dr. Razak, for those thought-provoking questions. I had a slide which explains that, but I couldn't present it. So I'll just summarize what I wanted to say. Now, the growth at risk, it's a reduced form framework. So it's very difficult. It works on principal components of the linear discriminant analysis as a methodology. And as you know, that it's very difficult to find out what is the economic intuition of those factors that come out of those principal components. Now, having said that, now how I chose, the first question was how partition variables is chosen. Now, one of the major requirements of the growth at risk framework is a very long time series. And it was really very difficult to choose the variables from this point of view, because our macroeconomic time series, they start from 1996. A good time series for India would start from 1996. So I had to keep that in mind while choosing those variables, choosing those variables. The second question is, there could be other shocks. Absolutely. As I had pointed out, there are some shocks which we have not accounted for. There are some shocks for which we have no data. So if we take some more shocks, say I take a leverage shock for which I have data, the growth distribution will change. Okay. You might see a larger growth at risk. I think the maximum growth at risk that I saw in my exercise, in my simulations, was minus 11%. So that's 1 year ahead. Now people will say, okay, the economy might move up, the vaccines are coming, the consumer sentiment is likely to go up. So what's going on? Why do you have minus 11%? And that's where I pointed out the two major concerns that we have, which will unfold in due course. One is our financial sector, the other is our investment sector. So if we add more shocks to it, the growth distribution will change, the growth at risk is likely to change. So that was the lower threshold that I gave. The third question that you had, rather an idea, I would say, what about trade policy uncertainty? As I said, I am working on that. I have an uncertainty module, which takes into consideration the entire policy uncertainty. Now, when we say uncertainty, we're actually looking at the second moment of the distribution. Okay? So instead of having a plain absolute level or a growth variable, we are now dealing with variances. Okay? So that I clubbed them together under one head, which says I'll have something called as Indian policy uncertainty. I have the WICS. I'll have trade policy uncertainty if I get a long series on that. So I'll put it under that, and I will interpret it as saying that, okay, what is the impact of an uncertainty module on the future growth rate or the future GDP? Thank you. Can I respond to one question? I can see one question that has been raised for me on the chat box. Okay, so Dr. Salim Rehan is asking, how do I see the impact of fiscal and monetary stimulus measures to reduce the negative magnitude of the growth at risk under COVID-19? So I think about the monetary policy measures, I think that will be taken into consideration because I already have a domestic financial conditions index. As I said, the term spreads that have taken into consideration, they actually capture the monetary policy stance. Okay, so those kind of monetary measures will be taken into consideration. Now, fiscal, I think in terms of fiscal, we have both quantitative measures as well as qualitative measures. And I have not yet found out, I mean, there is a delay in data, you can say. We can include government debt as one of the variables, or some kind of fiscal variable into the model to look at the impact. But then I think I'll have to put it as a separate module to look at the measures impact on the fiscal policy measures impact on future growth rate. But I think monetary measures will be taken into consideration because I already have a domestic financial conditions. I think that's the only question for me. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mana. If I move on to Dr. Faraji.
Yes, thank you. So I will answer with the reverse order also. So I will begin by the question of Dr. Razak. Yes, indeed, you are right. The number didn't change because of technical points. The point is, I consider a sample of 100 household, okay? So the approach to measure the poverty is the expenditure approach. So the variable of measure is the nominal consumption by household okay? So when we do the shock, we have 4 shock. We have the shock in the transfer or remittance, shock in foreign demand, and the combined shock, and the last is considering the government measure. Okay, so when the nominal consumption change, we have to count how many household will fall below the poverty line. This shows that the problem of having a small sample. I have the opportunity to make bigger, but because of time, it can be a good subject for another work. So just to say that I have planned before to give more detailed results, but with 100 sample, it's not relevant. For example, I can have more than 1,000. In this case, we will show a big difference between the 4 scenarios. Okay, that's the point exactly to respond to Dr. Razak. I hope it's clear technically. That's the problem of a short sample. I would like also, because I have the possibility, to show the impacts of inequality. And inequality by gender, by type of activity. There is the survey of the official survey is very rich. We have many things, but in order to not give a weight or a very condensed work, it will lose the important message to give clearly. That's to conclude with this one. For the question of Dr. Salim, yes, the closure are there. First, the numerator is the nominal exchange rate. Because of Morocco, we have a regime, a fixed regime rate. But just recently, Morocco will migrate to more float regime rates. But it's still very small float. So we can consider a fixed exchange rate, and exchange rate is, for our modest opinion, a good variable to have as numerator. So for the foreign variables, foreign trade variables, we have fixed the current account balance in percentage of GDP. We have the world demand for exports are exogenous. That's, I think it's natural. And for the government closure, we have only, we consider only the total current government expenditures, the total of goods and services. But by goods and services is indigenous. Okay? Why? Because we want to let the public deficit endogenous in order to see what happened. We don't want to make exogenous. We want to let it free to see the movement of the shock, because the shock will be so severe and accurate, so we have to see. Obviously, we can, after, if we have, you want to have more detailed results. So I have a very big Excel worksheet, so we can exchange after. About labor market, we have a public demand for composite labor exogenous. That's natural, because the public government, we don't have a market of labor. The government hire people in order by programming. That's I think in all the many countries in the world. And finally, the total supply of labor markets is exogenous. I know that there is some models which the supply, the labor supply is endogenous, but it's another type of kind of model. I hope I answered clearly to Dr. Slim. And the last question from one participant is about the support, the government support to businesses. Yes, let me clear one thing. That's in the presentation, it's not very detailed, but in the paper, it's more detailed again, but also in the paper, it's not very detailed. Why? Because the decision of support businesses came after the decision of household. The household support was instant with the beginning of the confinement. We have confinement 3 months between March and June. June, I think the second or the first week was the end of confinement. Still, the businesses concerned only the household. That's normal, because they need to live to consume. For businesses, now there is numbers, there is a creation of funds with contribution on many parts, not only government, but also some big businesses, some big companies and firms. So the support will be in 3 years, shared in the time. The first support will be effectively given in the coming days. And the really form of support given, it's not from the transfer of this fund, but about help from the government about social security. Some firms were exempt to pay this. It's a form of support. That's why if you can review the shock, it's small, because the number I give to the shock in the term of million dirhams, it's not really the total support. It's more than 10% or 5%. That's why I conclude the presentation by the last remark quickly to say that all these shocks concern only 3 months, and the coming yet can be more. So the results can change as shock can change. That's to conclude, and thank you for these very, very relevant questions.
Thank you, Dr. Faraji. Can I now invite Dr. Saxena to respond to some of the questions that have been raised?
Okay, thank you so much, Tushni. Thank you all for asking those questions, and let me thank at the beginning, because I'm going to kind of combine all the questions that were asked by Dr. Razak and then Salim and even Preeti, basically. So first thing that I heard, what was coming out, at least from Dr. Razak, was that basically we need to care about growth because sustainable development goals are something different. And that's not the holistic way of thinking, basically, and everybody thinks the same way, that growth is very different from actually caring about SDGs. They're not. So basically what you have to think about, and I'm a big proponent of that, you have to go beyond economic growth towards more better measures of well-being or whatever. Just having a 10% growth rate does not tell you much about either what the impact it has on the environment or on the society, basically. If all the money, all the gains from growth are going to the top people, right? And that's what happens. So I don't think of these two as very separate issues, as everybody else does. And like, I'll give you a clear example, actually. It's more about well-being. Why do we need growth? Because we think it enhances the well-being of people, right? That's kind of what we at least assume. And the only way to measure growth, the only objective way, or at least one number that's available for people to compare different countries, is by having this growth rate. This GDP growth was never ever started as actually something to be measuring well-being on. It was started back in during the Second World War or something, just to measure how much resources you have or whatever, right? When Kuznets started this, it was not to measure the welfare of societies or the well-being of people. Somehow we started to kind of conflate the two. So that's one thing. You have to, and you can have growth. You can grow, and you don't have to grow at 10%, but you can grow at a rate at which is basically in line with both people and planet. So I'll give you an example. In our last year's economic and social survey, we were actually talking about ambitions beyond growth. So if you continue to keep growing the way you are, at least the Asia Pacific region is, the damage to environment has been tremendous, and the consequences we already see. So think about it. Even in the 2000, we didn't even take 2008 crisis as a time to actually think about sustainability, because that was, so again, the emphasis exactly I remember was on let's actually get the growth rates up. So whatever you can invest in, and it was all infrastructure investment by China that literally pulled the whole world economy out of that recession. Okay, but there are consequences to having growth being driven by resource use, because it has consequences for the environment. And people don't think about it, but China's growth did actually pick up. But what has happened, the resource use and its impact on the environment are quite visible. Now, if you don't care about growth, the well-being and the sustainable development goals, now when is the time to think about it, okay? Another example. So basically like right now, if only we had thought about longer term well-being, we would have invested more in health at that time. And maybe it would have been a lot better for countries to deal with this current pandemic if only we had concentrated on health. But health is also seen something like we don't need it on a daily basis, right? Somehow it just doesn't factor into the growth. So we kind of always abstract. We think they're two different things, but they're not. Now, coming to the question that you were raising about, actually, so last year, just to give you a sense, and you also raised a point about how do you attract investment, okay? And so last year, we did estimate how much additional investment Asia Pacific developing countries would need in order to actually achieve the sustainable development goals by 2030, which means having universal education, universal healthcare, social protection, and dealing with the environment and all sorts. So we came up with the number actually, which was additional $1.5 trillion per year for Asia Pacific developing countries. Now that seems a lot. Actually, it's basically 5% of GDP. But if you look at the number in terms of less than $1 per person per day, that doesn't seem much. But the question always comes, where is this money coming from? And where is it going to come from? So of course, for some SDGs, you think that the government is going to be more involved in it when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to education and these kind of things. But there are lots of other places where you can have the private sector coming, okay? So for instance, you can actually have in infrastructure and all, you can attract private investment. How can you do that? Well, government can provide some enabling conditions. You can attract that. But the fact that there is so much of inefficiency, and coming to the question that Salim had raised basically about, well, there is little policy space. What do we do? You don't always have to have a bigger budget in order to do the same things. We've balanced our own budgets at home as well, actually. Sometimes it's not that in order to satisfy a bunch of different things, we need to always have more money. Within the same envelope, you can do that. One of the ways you can do it is basically look at your checkbooks. Like governments need to do, and what are they spending on? Fossil fuel subsidies. This region spends $240 billion per year in fossil fuel. Okay. And that is not, that's a regressive basically thing to do. It's not the poor people who get the advantage of it. In fact, if anything, they are basically being hurt. You can eliminate them and use that money to invest in green energy, basically, okay, renewable energy. You can actually do more social protection, like some kind of social programs. One can do that. And in a region, we only invest about 150, basically, $billion per year in renewable. So that's a difference of about $100 billion. We actually are spending more on fossil fuel. That's one of the ways you can do that. Again, at this time, if this is not the time to think about health, when is the best time? We had done our estimation last year. This was before COVID. We need, in order to improve our emergency preparedness for health, we need $880 million per year. Okay. Now, sometimes you wonder actually, where is this money going to come from? You can actually make sure that private sector can actually, I'll give you an example. So right now, how you could have, doing exactly what you were doing, you could have moved a little bit closer to the 2030 agenda and towards the sustainable development goals. You're loaning money to different businesses, right? Whenever you give money to people, you always have an upper hand on it. IMF will tell you that. You know, when you're taking a loan from the IMF, there are conditionalities that come along with it. This is where the governments can actually ask businesses to basically do more on the social front, and you know, wages should not be that low, those kind of things, and present a plan for us to go green at some point, right? And to go carbon neutral by a certain point in time. And one good example I'll give you was basically the airlines in France. I mean, like when France bailed the airlines out, they said, you know what, you have to give us a plan that you have to actually go carbon neutral by so and so date, right? That's what you can do. So within the same thing, what you're doing, you don't need more money. You can actually get there. Now, coming to one question I think you were raising, and of course, one of the other ways you can, within the same budget, as Salim was asking, you can still do it, is improve efficiency, which, you know, everybody would tell you. We had done it in our last year's survey, and we found out that for health and education, we could produce the same outcomes with 30% fewer resources, and for infrastructure by using 50% fewer resources. So that is an efficiency case which can actually be improved as well. Coming to your question on the regional cooperation, multilateralism. Now, my thing is actually going forward, it's gonna actually have a bigger dent, partly because COVID has exposed this whole fallacy, myth, whatever you call it, or the conventional wisdom we've had. Actually, we need to give precedence to efficiency over resilience. Okay. With the supply chains actually kind of basically cut off and not even having enough medicines to give to your own citizens, that actually makes everybody rethink about globalization a little bit more. And you will see maybe the global value chains are not going to be that long, they're going to be shorter ones or whatever. There's going to be a big change going there. Now, I'm not the kind of person who really thinks that multilateralism needs to be brought back. I don't know. It needs to be brought back. If it does, it has to be in a form that works for everybody. 75 years of this multilateralism hasn't worked. And one needs to change it, basically. It cannot happen. It cannot continue the way it's been going on. Part of the dissatisfaction around the world is basically this multilateralism hasn't worked. So it has to take a new form. What new form? One has to actually figure it out. But in the current way, it's not going to work. And last bit, I also wanted to actually, I think Preeti was like asking, how can we get to the SDGs? As I said, lots of things you can do by working within the same framework, but towards different goals. There are many goals, sustainable development goals, that do not require money. Gender equality, responsible consumption and production are some things that do not require more money, additional investment. There are lots of gender laws actually in different countries that prevent gender equality. If only you can get rid of those kind of discriminatory laws, you can still attain gender equality as well. Similarly goes for responsible consumption and production. I do feel that I think COVID, if anything, COVID should give us a pause to think about what kind of a lifestyle do we want. We all didn't die. Despite the fact growth tanked, I mean, like everybody is still living perfectly fine. We didn't die because it's not that whatever we consume to bump up the growth is not essential. It's pretty much inessential thing. We like to go to the mall and buy the 100th pair of shoes and the 100th pair of clothing. That's basically not an essential thing. It's not that you would die without it. And it has shown that you can still survive and survive perfectly fine. So one has to go think about it in a more holistic manner. I'm not per se actually as a degrowther basically, but I would, if one were to push me, I could go as far as being a degrowther. But the fact is that one has to be a little bit more cautious of what they're consuming. And just, I'll end on this because I think I want to give Dr. Nathan actually some time to respond. Oh, we are already out of time. But just one point. People are conscious of this fact. People do care about environmental social goals. People do care about how the products are produced, because in my survey that we produced this year, 2020, we actually were looking at different surveys that were conducted in Asia Pacific, and people are willing to pay a higher price for a good that's produced sustainably. Okay, so I'm just going to wrap up saying that, growth and sustainable development are not two different things, basically. We need to think in a more holistic manner if we were to achieve them and if we were to get out of this current rut, actually. Anyways, but I'll end here. Thanks.
Thank you, Sweta. Let me now move to Dev Nathan.
Okay, thank you. Thanks to Dr. Saxena. You said some of the things, and I don't need to repeat that. I'll just put it in somewhat different ways. One is that, there is a preoccupation not just with growth, but with efficiency as being or cost reduction or low cost reduction as being the only criterion on which the economy should function. But we need to hedge that, we need to change that, and not just make a single criteria with which everything is to be done. We do need to bring issues of justice and the environment. I spoke about the environment, but we also need to bring issues of justice into our discussion of the economy. Then why should what we think of as the economic way of doing something be the only thing that prevails? For instance, Bangladesh and India Bangladesh particularly has based its growth on utilizing the possibility for low-cost production in the garment industry. But is it a just manner in which the distribution of gains takes place between the brands and the Bangladesh suppliers and the Bangladeshi workers? There is no justice in this. There's a huge amount of subsidy involved because the wages are below the cost of production of labor power, which we may consider as a living wage. Wages are way below what many call the living wage. And where does this subsidy, who bears that subsidy? It is the women who are working in it, it is their families, and it is the rural economy to which they turn when there is a crisis, as we saw this time, which was much more present in India, where you had this spectacle of millions trying to go back to their rural homes after they had been thrown out of work in the urban centers that have come up. It also happened on a smaller scale in Bangladesh once they had utilized these small amounts of money they got. So the point is, there are subsidies involved which are used to build up the profits of the brands and which end up by immiserizing the South, which is participating in this. We have grown utilizing it, but there needs to be a change in the manner in which this is being done. When people talk in that we need a new kind of globalization, yes, I think this is where we need a change in the kind of globalization. Now, I will move from that to the question of theory and policy, because that was what I really dealt with more. I was doing it more in a provocative manner, thinking for myself and for my fellow author, co-author also. We were thinking for ourselves. We didn't really have answers. We had questions. Our first question was, with which we started, this is really exogenous. That's why we even put it out there in the title. That was what we thought about it, because when we heard everybody say this is exogenous, that means there's nothing we can do about it. That means it's like, Frank Knight's uncertainty. You don't know the probability that an event like the pandemic could occur. But can we turn that uncertainty into risk, where we can get some idea of the probability of such things happening? And to get an idea of the probability of such events happening, we need to get an idea. We need to understand the economy as a complex system. we think of the economy in a very mechanical manner. That's the model which we have built, very much based on physics, but we have not gone beyond that to be able to make the economy a complex system, which is really interacting. So the interactions are at all levels, including the interaction between what we are narrowly calling the economy and nature. So if I think of what do we need, I can't really say what we need, but I can just put three phrases over there. One is we need an analysis that is complex. Second, we need an analysis that is reflexive. And third, we need an analysis that is evolutionary. The economy is an evolutionary system, and we need to understand where we have taken it and how we can change the manner in which it is evolving, and not just leave it to chance to see how it will happen or what's going to come about. So that's the important thing. We don't have answers, but I think there are lots of people around the world who are thinking of these questions. There are institutes. I think there's a new economics institute at Oxford, and there's the Santa Fe Institute in the USA, who are all working on areas of complexity and evolution and how we can make the economic analysis a matter of reflexivity. That is the way in which we have to go in theory. With regard to policy, there are a few points which I mentioned that, yeah, we need to see how we can reduce the crowding of the biosphere. Do you know that the weight of all the domesticated animals in the world is more than that of animals in nature? Yes, it might sound very odd, but it is true. The weight of all the cattle, the camels, the chicken, the pigs, and everything else that we are growing as livestock, the domesticated animals, is actually more than that of animals in the wild. The weight, now we distinguish between plantation forests and natural forests. Yes, the forest cover is growing, but a lot of it is plantation, which is very, very less biodiverse than a natural forest. So we need to see how are we going to reduce how are we going to reverse the reduction of the biosphere. We need to recognize limits in what we are doing, and we have reached many of those limits. The climate change tells us we have reached a certain limit in terms of the greenhouse gases which we can emit. If we continue in that manner, we're going to have changes where we cannot say what will happen. If we allow the temperatures to rise more than 2 degrees at the time of the Industrial Revolution, we don't know what will happen to the Earth as we know it. So there are limits, and we need to understand those limits. And the one, as I mentioned, which is to stop the reduction of the biosphere, and therefore the crowding of animals in that, and therefore reducing the stress conditions in which they live, and understand these interactions. We need to begin to think of the interaction. We don't even think of it. That is why we very easily put it aside as an act of God or as an exogenous shock. But we need to move beyond that. We don't have answers, but if we don't ask the questions, we will never get the answer. It's easier, of course, to ask a question. It's much more difficult to have a theory, and even more difficult to build a model. But we need to go in that direction. And the idea of this putting forward this short presentation was really to spread the point that more of us need to be involved in questioning the theory that we are practicing. We as teachers have been teaching these theories, and we have reached a point where our theories have brought us to a huge crisis in the world, which our theory can no more explain. And we need to therefore go beyond.
Devanathan, may I, can we wind up on that note as we are running out of time?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I will wrap up this session since I think we have gone through an extensive Q&A session. I hope that all the queries that were raised were responded to. I mentioned at the start that I'm not going to take on the privilege of 10 minutes to wrap up, but just one point I wanted to raise, and I come back to the point that Dr. Razak raised about the tensions between trying to revive growth as a primary objective, and the need to pay attention to issues of sustainable development goals. And I have some sympathy for what Dr. Razak mentioned, coming from experiences here as well, that governments are going to go for growth, and given the extraordinary circumstances that we are in, and anything related to the equity or the sustainable or inclusiveness of the growth process is going to be secondary, and we'll wait until some sustained signs of economic recovery have been are in place. So I think it's going to be a bit of a hard-fought battle to convince governments to take a more broader view on making that growth process a more inclusive and sustainable one at this point. My sense is that most governments will want to see very attractive short-term numbers in some sense to satisfy themselves and satisfy their electorates that things are under control and things are getting better. But I fully agree with the point that was raised, that in the medium to long term, that's not going to serve us. And we need to pay more attention to resetting our fiscal monetary policies, particularly I think on the fiscal side, to spend more on health, to spend more on social protection. The challenges before us, given that tax revenues are also shrinking as a result of COVID-19, how are we to deal with all of this? What are the collective measures that we can take as a region in terms of appealing for debt relief and all the rest of it, are matters that still need to be discussed at length, and some policy solutions arrived at. I believe there is another session that is devoted to macroeconomics in the SANEM conference, so I hope that some of these issues will be taken up then. So I am going to wind up with once again thanking Dr. Salim Raihan and congratulating SANEM in putting together a wonderful panel, some very good papers that were presented, and frankly, I quite enjoyed listening to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Dushni, and I must thank all the presenters and discussants and all the participants. I think we had an excellent session, especially the presentations were all excellent and the discussion followed discussion. So I must thank Dushni again for your valuable intervention and your time. And I invite you all for the next session, which will start in 20 minutes or 19 minutes from now. So with this, I'd like to conclude this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Salim.
Thank you
No
so
lunch,
much.
no refreshments, no dinner. How
Now we
wonderful.
can go and have our own